associate professor in AAAD, and I'm happy to introduce our second speaker of this year's Colloquium series. We have one more speaker in 2 weeks on November 4th, Justin Gomer, who is a professor at Cal State Long Beach, who's going to be speaking about his book about Hollywood and race. So for those of you who are interested in that, you can check out our website and register for that talk. And then next semester, also, you can find this information on our website. We have 4 scheduled talks for the spring semester. But today I'm very happy to introduce someone from our own department who is giving today's talk, Alicia Monroe, who is a teaching assistant professor in African American, and diaspora studies. Alicia received her PhD in history from Emory University and her MA in Latin American studies from the University of Kansas. She has done research in Brazil for several years. She has some recent publications in the Journal of Africana Studies and the Hispanic American Historical Review. And this talk, I believe, is taken from her current book manuscript that is underway, which is entitled Black Leading Men, Gender, Power, and Afro-Palestino Religious and Secular Associations, 1830 to 1930. And so with that, I will turn it over to you, Alicia. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we can get started. So let me just start by thanking everyone for being here. I know this is the time in the semester when you return to your working space or to your desk, there are stacks of items waiting for you. So I really do know that there's much work to be done. So thank you so much for carving out the time to be here this morning. And the project that I'm sharing is part of the book manuscript and kind of a separate project as well. So it's kind of a bit of both. And I've really been thinking about the way that people enact their freedom in this period of transition from enslavement to freedom. And so the talk is titled Visual, and sometimes it's called Material Markers of Freedom. So you can help me kind of think through this title since it is a genuine working paper. And we're going to be looking at images of Afro-Brazilian laborers during gradual abolition and beyond. So 4 women sat in front of their wares on the edge of a narrow street sometime in the year 1875. You may have seen this picture, you may not have, but it's Rio. And so the sun, as we might expect, kind of beamed brightly on the photographic subjects in southeastern Brazil. Here we have a map of Brazil. If you haven't traveled there, haven't worked with this area very much, Brazil has 5 major regions in the modern period. And our work today is focused on southeastern Brazil, which is the economic heart of the nation, I would say, as of the 19th century. And coffee is the crop that is really facilitating the growth of the provinces of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, which are sort of the probably most prominent provinces or states, but also the state and province of Minas Gerais and Espírito Santo are critical as well. And the Southeast is mostly kind of framed as distinct from the Northeast, though Rio and Salvador are probably the cities that are most important. And of course, Salvador is considered like Black Rome, this heart of African cultural expression. So even though our work is focused on southeastern Brazil, to some extent, because Rio is such an important port, around 2 million people will enter the port of Rio in the 19th century. So while the Northeast is really important, I would say in the early colonial period with sugar plantations and cultivation, by the time we get to the 19th century, as of 1763, Rio is the capital of the colony. And by 1960, the capital is moved to the federal district here in the central area because there's not a lot of population density. So Brazil is very coastally oriented, and Rio is a critical city for the nation, but also within this region of southeastern Brazil. As we go back to the image, at the far left of the vending site and the image, we really see several wide brimmed baskets filled with plantain and other fruit as the vendor sat on the ground with maybe a small table. So, one woman on the far left of the image sat with knees, ankles, and feet covered by her long, light colored skirt. And she and her immediate neighbor both wore swaths of cloth, referenced in Brazil as pano da costa. Pano da costa boast about their shoulders and about their waist. Pano da costa is generally a cotton based textile that traveled from West Africa um, through commodity exchanges in both the colonial period up until 1822 and through imperial Brazil through 1889. And women of African origin and descent constituted the material's principal market in Portuguese America. So it is a commodity that's moving through across the Atlantic and is being consumed by women of African origin. So Pano da Costa remained in high demand throughout the 19th century in coastal provincial capitals, and it really marked sort of an ongoing aesthetic set of practices exclusive generally to women of the African diaspora. Pano da Costa is not widely consumed by other elements of the population. So Pano da Costa's incorporation into daily wear might also be understood as a sign of participation in Yoruba-based Orisha veneration practices, with use of particular colors or cloth indicating spiritual bonds between particular Orisha and those that Orisha may call. So our first unnamed photographic subject sat with three additional women, as we can see. And each of the women had deep ebony toned skin, indicating their African ancestry. I would say the third woman here draws our attention, seemingly peering across the centuries, looking directly at us. She meets the gaze of the person capturing the moment in the photograph. And this particular woman is not performing stillness for the photographer. A scholar, Tina Kemp, might readily note. She's looking, she's moving, she's not placed. We can see movement in her face. And the final of the four women sat clad in a dark colored blouse framed with white ruffles that in the late 19th century and today kind of managed to convey seriousness, whimsy, and femininity, maybe all at once. The final facet of the image calling the viewer's attention are the feet, perhaps, of the fourth woman who had otherwise had taken a certain command to the completeness of her public self-fashioning. What would her unshod feet mean or communicate to those she met? And what might its significance mean for her, but also for us? So the four women in this image emerge in more than one photographic archive in the Americas. One copy of the image is housed in the New York Public Library photographic collection at the Schomburg Center for the Study of Black Culture, where the words, as you can see here at the bottom, market women, Rio de Janeiro, really serve as the only identifier situating the women in time and space. The original picture has been credited to the Brazilian photographer Mark Ferrez, who produced a substantial body of photographs of outdoor landscapes and less than 100 images of human subjects, mainly in the 1870s, the 1880s, and the 1890s in Brazil. And he lived from 1843 to 1923. He was from a French family of artists, trained in Paris, and then returned to Brazil. So he has a large body of work. The photograph produced by Mark Perez and its copies have really circulated across the Americas, mostly in academic monographs. The image began circulation anew in Brazil and beyond in 2015. in an exhibition titled Emancipation, Inclusion, and Exclusion, Challenges of the Past and Present, curated by anthropologist Lilia Mort-Schwartz, historian Marina Elena Machado, along with archivist Sergio Borgi. And it really garnered international attention. I first heard this story as I listened to NPR back in 2015. And there have been multiple stories covering this exhibition. So the women were the photographic subject of one item of a 17 image exhibit at the Museum of Contemporary Art on the campus of the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil's wealthiest and most prestigious university, um, utilizing images held by the Morales Salas Institute, which is basically a cultural institute and archive focused on music, art, and photography. And it's important because they have holdings in both Rio and Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais. So the exhibition occupied a prominent public space in the city of Sao Paulo. Anyone moving through the center of the city would go by that institute that held this exhibition right on the Avenida Sao Paulista. So the exhibition really spread a lot of public interest within Brazil and beyond its border for its capacity to visually document use of unfree, coerced labor not far from the dawn of the 20th century. And photographic images produced by Mark Ferrez, Victor Frond, and George Leozinger served as the basis for the exhibition. So scholars of Brazil have published a small but growing number of works based on photographs and reproductions used for Cartes-de-Visite in the late 19th century. In the past decade, museums, archives, and universities, including our own, have increased engagement with the topic of enslavement in terms of research, archival collecting, curation, and public programming, usually through digital humanities projects, which have really widened the availability and accessibility of images previously consigned to physical published books. When students do presentations, right, they have the same photos that I do because of the availability of them. And so one of the things that we should think about, the circulation of these images that had once been kind of rarely seen outside of scholarly publications are widely accessible for viewing, interpretation, misinterpretation, discussion. So one of the things that I contend is that the discipline of history, which generally privileges written text over other kinds of source materials, really must have a greater stake in the interpretation of visual images, especially when engaged historical narrative has a need to be more visual and evocative, to resonate and foster complex rather than reductive renderings of sources, and also of collective memory. As Joshua Brown suggested in the journal American Art, and I quote, historians must be willing to treat photographs and other archival evidence with the same seriousness and rigor they apply to text, end of quote. So in an interesting and an increasingly visual digital environment, historians, I think, really must accept the charge of establishing methodological and pedagogical practices which facilitate and produce ethically informed, engaged publics in visual interpretation practices that can work to simply just avoid re-inscribing marginalization and disempowered photographic subjects. What do we see? And who do we see and how? So Brazil constitutes a really useful case for the examination of visual culture and material performances of both slavery and freedom, because Brazil had a decidedly strong urban caste, and slavery had, and freedom had a strong caste until final emancipation in 1888. You already know, Brazil is the last nation in the Americas where slavery is dismantled. Slavery persists until May 13th, 1888, Though around the decade of the 1850s, the system really begins to wane due to intensifying international pressure and the Brazilian political authorities finally enforcing political treaties from the 1830s, which would work to ban international commerce and bonded African arrivals. So really, the end of routine importation of forced laborers contributed to slavery's decline, though illegal transatlantic importation continued until 1867, the year when the last ship of bonded arrivals landed in the province of Rio de Janeiro. So at a national level, when slavery unfolds, when it ends, nearly 700,000 souls transition to legal autonomy. We know that Brazil received the largest number of enslaved people in the Atlantic, in the Americas, approximately 4.8 million people, and approximately 2.2 million people come through the port of Rio in the 19th century. So the cities of Salvador, Rio, Recife, and Sao Paulo held slave populations in the 19th century that ranged from, in Salvador, 60% to 30%, which is a small number in the city like Sao Paulo. Historian Sidney Chalubi in 1873, excuse me, in his he's looking at the 1872 national census, and he notes that 73% of Blacks and Pardos, so people of multiracial descent, were free at the time of the first Brazilian national census. So this is the really the inverse of the United States, right? So manumission had really constituted a pathway to freedom, and there were high rates, large numbers of people who were free compared to the United States, where only approximately 11% of the Black population lived as free people in 1860 before the Civil War. So again, we have more people who are free in Brazil than who are enslaved by the time slavery ends. So again, what does freedom look like? What does forced labor look like? Furthermore, the law of the free womb, also called the law of Rio Branco, went into effect on September 28, 1873, technically freeing children born to enslaved mothers. And the point here is that you have a gradual emancipation plan meant to appease planters. So slavery was to phase itself out because at a certain day people would be born free, but essentially their parents were still enslaved, and slavery would come as people passed away. So it would be very gradual. So the provisions of the free womb law required owners to pay for the care of the child until age 8, or tutors, I should say. Generally, free children born to enslaved mothers remained under the tutelage of masters until age 21, but there really were some provisions that meant to propel the phasing out of enslavement. The law of Rio Branco ended bondage for enslaved people who were held or owned by the state, and it made provisions for the establishment of a state administered fund to purchase freedom for enslaved people not liberated by the law of Rio Branco itself. So finally, the provisions also guaranteed and protected the right of enslaved people to buy their freedom. So there had already been customary practice of people purchasing their freedom, but there was now legal protection so that owners couldn't seize money or take money that people had made to secure their freedom and then misappropriate it. So again, we're in a city, we're in the city of Rio, and cities in the nation, again, had always attracted free and liberated enslaved people called libertos. And cities were really important sites where freedom and servitude kind of were being worked out through contract labor, but also as people went about in autonomy. So, exactly how would freedom and enslavement be documented as lithographs gave way to daguerreotypes and as photographic images became less expensive to produce and therein could capture a wider swath of daily life. What would images of forced servitude depict? And would photographers have an interest in documenting the transition from forced to free labor? Would we see more instances of servitude or freedom? If we think about enslavement in American history, what kind of depictions do we carry with us? And when we think about Brazilian experience of enslavement, what do we think of with these different timelines at play? So how would freedom be visually depicted? So again, I'll use the work of Mark Ferez to think about these questions. He is most famous for images of infrastructure. Here, our map shows again, we can see images of a database that makes different kinds of images available to the public. So this is the Slavery Images website. It was started at the University of Virginia Humanities Project, and it is often cited and used as a repository, particularly for items that do not have copyright prohibitions. People go to this website and they use images for publications, presentations, and students also. So again, this kind of indication of how we see more access to images. Also, again, our map here is meant to just emphasize how important West Central Africa and West Africa are in terms of the overall trade. And of course, these are taken from Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, written by David Eltis and David Richardson, published, I think, in 2008. And again, we can see West Africa and West Central Africa as contributing to the stream of people moving across the Atlantic. Finally, again, this map emphasizes again how important Southeast Brazil is. So this map is a detail of the total disembarkations or number of people who are disembarking in the Americas. So we know that is an estimated 10.7 million people. And we know that, again, the map emphasizes that southeastern Brazil is in a really important area in terms of arrivals. And again, that's mostly in the 19th century. And we can also account, those circles represent kind of volumes of people. And so we can see how important South America and the Caribbean, how important those sites are in terms of arrivals to the Americas. But again, southeastern Brazil here. Here's where Rio and Sao Paulo would be, right? The volume of the arrivals actually is larger than what we see in the city of Bahia itself. But again, most people are arriving through the port of Rio. And again, here we can see the flows of people with about 2 million people, again, over the span of the entire trade from 1501 to 1867. So southeastern Brazil, again, is an important destination. The image here kind of shows Brazil in this moment of transition. Mark Ferez is documenting people, but he's also documenting processes. And he's documenting both rural and urban infrastructure. So we can see dams, bridges, and markers of modernization and industrialization, including railroads, tram lines, and steamships. And this particular image, we're seeing a waterwork that's meant to serve the city. Usually when he features people, he's usually working outdoors. He also is really known for these wide panoramic shots and views of landscapes and people positioned in them. When he featured people as subjects, he generally, again, worked outdoors, whether taking photographs of elite club members or working sector vendors in public plazas, who are also called quitandeiras. And again, they're defined by their ambulant or fixed commerce across urban spaces. So we come back to our orienting image here. What would be the purpose of creating images highlighting exclusively Black service sector workers in a nation that's moving from forced to free labor? What do these images aim to do? Did they seek to document typical unfree labor tasks or tools before that kind of work passed from public memory? Did these images work to document a disappearing type of urban labor and a disappearing type of laborer? Um, were they meant to re-inscribe the connection between Blacks and manual labor, even as freedom became increasingly imminent? Also, a question that we might think about, could depictions of women at work in markets like the one we have here do something other than represent manual labor as denigrating? Could it be read with a certain assumptions about dignity of work, even though we know that within Iberian America, manual labor had been heavily stigmatized since the colonial period? And I guess the final question is, can transnational publics today see these images and interpret the photos informed by a Black feminist ethos that might offer new readings of the women and value associated with their labor? I argued that scholars and this project kind of aims to address the methods need to first kind of accurately situate and read these images, and then to maybe imaginatively interpret primary visual source material in classroom instruction, but also in wider scholarship. What do we see and how? So, photographic imaging technology arrived in Brazil in 1839, but became less expensive by the 1850s and became widespread by the 1860s. Um, One thing to note about Mark Ferrez, he had his own independent shop in the city of Rio de Janeiro, and that the emperor, Dom Pedro II, the constitutional monarch who reigned from 1840 to 1889, was a photography enthusiast, and he actually served as a patron for Mark Ferrez. So Mark Ferrez landscape works became particularly well known. When we look at this picture, are we seeing portraits, collective portraits, or are we only seeing ethnographic types in the images before us? What's the work of this photo? Angela Rosenthal and Agnes Louise Ortiz, in an edited volume entitled Slave Portraiture in the Atlantic World, argues that the photographic representation of enslaved African people and their descendants was characterized by discursive tension from its inception due to both scientific racism and broader societal racism. So, bonds people operated in a legal and social system predicated on commodification of their bodies and their labor, which required, in her words, sort of erasure and reproducibility. These are common ideas when we think of diasporic studies. Therefore, portraiture, which focuses on individualized subjects, had a culturally embedded paradoxical relationship and tension with enslaved subjects. Rosenthal and Louis Lugo Ortiz argue and write, and I quote here: the logic of chattel slavery strived to produce the body of the slave in a very restricted manner, as a purely instrumentalized being, as a body dwelling in the eternal present of labor, reproduction, and punishment. The body of the slave appears as the site of a non subject, of an entity without memory or history. And portraiture, on the other hand, insists on the face as a primary site of imagined subjectivity, often at the expense of the rest of the body, end of quote. So usually when we see portraits, we do have this orientation that emphasizes the face or the upper body, particularly people are standing beside bust and we see them waist up. And so she's arguing that even when we get certain kinds of um, paintings and other visual images of African or Black subjects or African descent subjects, again, what are we seeing if representation of individuality and subjectivity is at odds with enslavement and in general? So, in any rendering of enslaved subjects in the racialized Atlantic system, are there genuine possibilities for what we might see other than servitude? Can we actually see freedom? Existence historiography suggests that both free and enslaved people used the garments they wore and their self representation beyond the walls of their domiciles to suggest legal autonomous status. The work of Tamara Walker in her article, He Outfitted His Family with Noble Decency. She works on colonial Peru. And her new book called Exquisite Slaves suggests that bondspeople fleeing forced servitude seized and utilized clothing to perform freedom. So, use of new or well maintained garments helped those absconding from forced servitude, quote unquote, blend into free society and lessen their chances of identification as a fugitive. Historian Kelly Gage, in the article Forced Crossing, the dress of African slave women in Rio de Janeiro in 1861, argues that advertisements for fugitives or people who had absconded for in pursuit of their freedom um, worked to utilize descriptions of clothing and prioritize clothing that formerly enslaved people had taken with them. So again, clothing is used to track people, but the clothing that they take to again perform their freedom is also featured in these ads of people who had run away. Engage suggests that the Brazilian public really did perceive garment quality and condition as a way to assess if someone lived in bondage or as a free autonomous person. So, wearing the right kind of garment suggested access to income and well being, and even people who were fleeing enslavement wanted to look the part of an independent, autonomous citizen. And clothing and garment arrangement functioned as important tools to corroborate autonomy. So it's not really that surprising, though, that clothing use and the pursuit of freedom would fuse. We might consider, though, what it meant to be well dressed, which is, again, subjective, and what it meant to be well dressed in sites of labor and leisure that didn't have perhaps rigid delineation. Here, my work with confraternities can be used to help us think about this issue. So most urban spaces, confraternities or lay Catholic brotherhoods, were Afro-Catholic associations of members who assembled to venerate saints, but also to really have social bonds. There were festivals, um, Holy Week celebrations where people moved through with torches and candlelight. And so they were really spaces of inclusion. So the churches where sodalities met and served really functioned as really important points of assembly where cultural articulations of Black identities could be performed during festivals, during funerals, and regular religious and secular holidays. The Church of Our Lady of the Rosary of Black Men of Sao Paulo, often the celebrations caught the attention of chroniclers, not necessarily everyday residents, but chroniclers. Um, In addition to, and I quote, the batuques, sambas, and mozambiques, which occurred on church property, city chronicler A.E. Martins noted that numerous bands of African musicians played tambaque, which is a type of zeperera, singing and dancing in pairs, donned in white cloth, which they wrapped around their heads with a bracelet of silver, a rosary of gold, wrapped around their dresses. So both clothing arrangement and adornment represented a visible and unique part of African diaspora religiosity and material culture, even in southeastern Sao Paulo, in the southeastern region. So we expect material culture to be present in the Northeast, but I'm arguing that the Southeast is also a place where we can see material religious culture and clothing as a part of that religiosity. As men and women assembled for festivities to honor patron saints, again, self fashioning was a consequence. The capacity to elicit favorable public response and confraternities were part of state and civic engagement. So the capacity to adorn oneself in a way that elicited favorable public response cross lines of gender and age. Textual evidence suggests that parents and caregivers especially reveled in dressing up their little children. Antonio Martins notes, and I quote, the children of Africans, Black Africans, accompanied their mothers, presenting themselves well dressed. And so the accessories, even more than the garments confraternity members used for dressing themselves and their children, call attention to the multicultural reality sodalities and confraternities represented. Female festival attendees and their little ones wore rosaries of red, amulets, jaguar teeth, figas of ebony, olho de cabra, and pacova, all about their necks to shield their children from the evil eye. The observations, and this image that we have here is by a different photographer than Mark Ferrez, and I'd ask you to kind of think about how the differences that we see. There is, I would argue that this ideal of stasis that Tina Camp mentions that I referenced in the earlier part of the talk, there's this kind of fixed quality, they're emotionless, and it shifts the tone and the mood of the photograph that I think is really distinct from the market women. And I think that's characteristic of the work of Cristiano Junior and is one of the reasons why the photography of Mark Perez is of such interest for me. So the observations and accounts of Marcin suggest that West Central Africans and their offspring dressed up, including religious paraphernalia and paraphernalia that could be easily interpreted within a West or West Central African political authority, idiom of political authority for the 18th and 19th century, with the fly whisk, with the coverings of the heads, all could say a lot about Yoruba ideas and also Bakongo ideas about religious philosophy. Finally, let me go to one other image here. And so I talked about the term olio de cabra, and that might not be um, particularly clear what that indicates. And so olio de cabra is not literally a goat's eye. It is meant to, it is a seed. And this is a seed that is found in the Americas, also in the Circum-Caribbean. It's called a rosary pea. And these seeds, particularly in West Central African religious thought, would be quite striking because of the red and black symbols or colors. Colors here, usually black represents living people, and red represents this potential of blood and this transitions between our world and the world of the ancestors. So the coat itself represents our life and potential almost, kind of like the ideal of Ashe, the power to make things happen, though we're moving from a West African to a different kind of West Central African context. But these rosary keys are recorded in these observations by city chroniclers. And it's very clear that folks who are coming to the confraternity festivals and people who are working are wearing this kind of religious paraphernalia. And we should also understand the rosary is by the early colonial period as a multicultural um, piece of religious technology. It's not just Catholic. It's already by the 17th, 18th century been used in divination by Yoruba people in Cuba, but also in Brazil. So, women of African origin and descent living in Rio, Sao Paulo, and smaller cities in the 1780s and 1770s and 1780s really wore clothes that marked their conceptual and intellectual autonomy. And they had a sense of aesthetics that were really shaped by their homelands of provenance. A portion of women in southeastern cities dressed in pano da costa. They wrapped their hair loosely or tightly and set about cities to work and to worship in collective spaces in clothing articles that made sense to them and to the publics they encountered. Use of pano da costa, use of olho de cabra, and the um, other spiritual technologies that have been mentioned really operate as evidence of market ties and aesthetics in motion with some mediation, because it really is um, a transatlantic process that's unfolding in terms of clothing and adornment. So, in conclusion, talked a little more than I thought I would, but photographs certainly cannot replace the textile analysis of conservators and examination of cloth commodity exchanges carried out by economic historians. But photographs can help us look anew as we can see unexpected signals and performances of belonging, not oriented in the way we might expect. Old sources from the 1870s and 1880s really might function as new data sets if we decenter male identified historical subjects and bodies. So if we look at adornment and women's clothing choices, we might see new things. And also elite expectations associated with attire. So visual and material markers really can chronicle individual autonomy and shared diasporic identities that may be indicators of power and conceptions of self. So thank you very much. Let me stop sharing the screen here, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions, comments, and reflections that you have.
Does anyone have any questions? Or if you'd like to type a question on chat, you can do that as well.
Yes, George.
Oh, George, you're muted.
Okay, thanks for the presentation, which was very informative and excellent. I just have a question about this whole question of African cultural survivals in the Americas, going back to Melville Herskovits's argument about cultural survivals, and those who argue that we shouldn't be talking so much about survivals as to innovations and the new culture. Now, you mentioned the Yoruba and the Congo. Is there way we can talk about a totally new African culture in Brazil, but it's not necessarily, but may borrow from the survivals of Congolese and Yoruba culture, but it's something totally new coming out of the experience that people lived in Brazil and the other connection they had of the indigenous population and the Europeans.
Right. I mean, this is an ongoing fight that I think is probably not over. I would say the current historiography and the kind of work of James Sweet in Recreating Africa, the book Domingos Alvarez, African Healing and the Intellectual History of the Atlantic World would indicate that there's a lot of new evidence looking particularly at non-textual sources and textual sources that really support this idea that there is continuity. I would say there's both, right? That's always the right answer, that there really is innovation, because the olio de cabra is something that you would find across the Americas. And so there's always this kind of utilization of local flora and fauna to produce a material culture. So we do really get something, we get products that are shaped by the realities in the Americas and the material that are available. So there really is, I think, people are still fighting about this question in a productive way. Um, and there's really evidence of kind of both things happening. And because people come so late, the 1860s is not right a long time ago, not, and it's not. And so there is this imprint of people with living memory of their homelands that shows up in these um, materials and the way these materials are fashioned. And so I think that there's still struggle, and I think that new kinds of evidence are being used to address it. There's also a project, I'll just say one more thing, where people are looking at bolsas de manjinga and these um, satchels that contain elements of power that are meant to protect, to bring all the things that any religious item was supposed to do, right? Fortune, good fortune. And there's a scholar who is now going to the archive and looking at all this stuff, all this ephemera that often has not been utilized. So, yeah, I think that again, that this question you've asked is still it remains a really important and orienting question, and there's evidence for continuity and creolization and some of the emergence of something new.
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure. Go ahead.
Thank you. Alicia, what a great talk you gave. I thought that the information that you have is fascinating. I think your call to historians to not neglect the visual world of evidence that we have from these earlier periods, and to dig deeper and more thoughtfully into those visual realms as you are doing. I think that that's a very appropriate call for historians and others to be involved in. I have two questions actually. One has to do with the nature of the photos that you've been able to come across and request that you speculate perhaps about, you know, what sort of distinctions or distinctiveness might be across certain kinds of photos. For example, many of the photos, or the photos that you selected, and the one that you kept coming back to with the four ladies sitting, appeared to be urban photos. They were taken market women or vendors in Brazil. And I think you're asking some fascinating questions about dress and posing and the gaze of these women, especially that particular woman right into the camera and so forth. Was there a rural or agricultural countryside analog to that kind of photography? That is, from what you've seen, was it a preoccupation with urban photography, people in urban spaces? Is that the bulk of it? Or is it the case that there's also archives of people in the sugarcane fields and the coffee plantations and so forth And if that's the case, that is, if we can juxtapose an urban photography and an archive of rural photography, what do the two tell us? That is, you ask a great question in regard to the sort of humanity that these photographs are capturing through the labor that's portrayed. And women in the marketplace in Rio, looking right into the camera, I think portray a certain sort of visualized agency and humanity than, let's say, people out in the coffee fields or in the mines and so forth would be able to portray in photographs. So I think your question in regard to how manual labor is being valued, how it's been portrayed, how the body, how the facial portrait, and all those things, great questions. And I'm wondering if there's perhaps a rural urban split, or just the kinds of labor that people have been called upon in different geographies that suggests a certain sort of humanity that the photographer is trying to capture. So just, I guess the question is one about, to ask you to explore more about the rural landscape and the urban geography, and then the kind of labor that is being captured, and what does that say to us in regard to the certain sort of humanity that the creators of these photos and the certain sort of human being that the creator of these whole photos are trying to reveal to us. The second question has to do with the authors of the photos at the time. I would assume that most of the photos in the late 19th century are being produced by white cameramen or photographers. Is there a period of time, maybe the early 20th century, in which you have Black photographers creating archives of photography? Actually, your story here reminds me a lot of the American South, in which you have, after emancipation 1865, a photography of former slaves appearing, but it's mostly a photography that's created by northern whites or southern whites. Of course, there's a lynching photography, an archive that is produced by onlookers and also the perpetrators. And there's an archive of perpetrators, by the perpetrators of lynchings, that come out of the American South during this time period, which is perhaps uniquely American. So I'm wondering, one, in regard to this late 19th century photography that you're looking at Brazil, who the photographers are. I'm just assuming that they're white elites or middle class folks who can afford cameras and to pose people for pictures. And do we have a period, maybe in the 20th century sometime? In the United States, it's mostly the early 20th century Harlem Renaissance, in which you have very rich archives created by Black photographers. Is there such a period of time in Brazil where you have Black photographers appearing on the scene? And what are they capturing something different than these early or late 19th century photographers, white photographers, are capturing in regard to the humanity of Black Brazilians? I'm sorry, there was a lot there. So however you want to, whatever direction that you want to take either of the questions.
I had brought up a photo of this photo to kind of speak to this urban and rural divide and set of experiences. And so this again is the same photographer, Mark Verdes, and we can also kind of see his signature wide landscape, right? We can see the mountains and hills where coffee production is unfolding. And so I would say I've been kind of thinking about over time, what have I really been seeing, of course, right? What is it we really are trying to capture? I think this photograph kind of indicates or kind of helps. The urban images seem to have, I think there's a different spatial dynamic that seems to show up. He almost seems closer to the urban subjects. And so I'm wondering about how actual physical space is working. And also, when we go back to kind of the public works images, one of the things that I think that is notable is that, in fact, we do see a certain kind of distance between the photographer and in this image between the people who are laboring, right? He's not nearly as close to them. Though I guess that perspective is kind of one of the things being captured. Though, if we were to go back to the coffee image, if we were to go close up, we can see a lot more detail. So I think there is a different way. He is treating urban spaces and perhaps the subject of the Kitandera, of these market vendors, in a way that's more intimate, but distance. I don't know how. I think there's something happening with space that I haven't quite figured out what it means, but definitely his proximity, um, I think, is communicating something. And sure, I have not found particular work, nor because kind of my work tends to end in the late 19th century. I have not um, considered the question of early 20th century photographers, though, because there's so much photography associated with the practice of candomblé in the Northeast. We do know that, the archive of Pierre Verger, um, the archive of anthropologists, including and historians like Manuel Canino, would include images, but I haven't seen as much work from the Southeast. So I think that's a question that is a good one, and I don't have the answer, and I'd like to know, to push forward in time. So thank you for that question about, because when I think about these photographs, I always go to the Harlem Renaissance, and I wonder how people might see these women across the diaspora and think about them in urban space. And so, so thank you for that question. I will stop sharing now, and those considerations. Thank you very much.
Do we have another question? I'll jump in and ask one last one as we finish out the hour. I was really intrigued by some of the questions you raised. I really enjoyed the talk. And I was wondering about, have you explored like the circulation of these images? I think you speculated what was the purpose of why did Ferrez take these pictures? Was he trying to promote certain ideals or certain representations of freed women working in Sao Paulo? Do you have a sense of how the images circulated, how they were received, where they were published?
So Mark Perez has a major collection of holding in the John Paul Getty Museum. They have over 200 works cataloged by him of um, mostly landscape, but also people. So he exhibited in world fairs. There was a lot of contention about how to represent slavery, like to make it disappear, to have it be visible. And so usually we can see again kind of European immigration and whitening at work here, and sort of people of African descent kind of being disappeared because of Brazil's lack of um, kind of struggle with how to present itself to the world. Is it modern? Is it industrialized? Is it European? Is it African? And there was a real kind of effort by political authorities, including Pedro II, before we get the transition to a republic, to really represent Brazil through a lens of European as a European colonial product and project. So,
So his images circulated in exhibitions that were sort of promoting the country. Is that?
yes. So, because of his connection with the emperor, they really end up being images that are shown in these international exhibitions in Paris, in New York. And so his work is traveling very early. And so I think in the middle of the 20th century, that work, there's a lot of his work that is connected to the cities itself. So when you see retrospectives of Sao Paulo, when you see retrospectives of Rio, these works are the ones that show up. That's how we actually have images, his images are the ones used. But the people, the images of the people, I think, have been less represented publicly. So there's different ways that the work is circulating, depending on, right, the intention of the facilitator. But most of the images that you have in your mind of Rio are probably from Mark Fedez and Victor Freund, particularly Ferrez, because of the panoramic shots and the techniques that he was mastered. So
Great. Again, thank you so much. This was a really informative talk. And we'll give you a virtual hand clap.
thank you so much. I know you're busy, and have a good afternoon. I really appreciate the time. Thanks so much and for your questions. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Tchauzinho.